So time then for the press preview. It's our first look at what is on the front pages of tomorrow's papers, and this evening we'll see what's making the headlines with our two guests, the Guardian columnist Zoe Williams and also the Telegraph's assistant comment editor Olivia Utley. A very good evening to both of you. Good to see you. We'll speak in a moment. We're going to check out those front pages for you though, first of all. Starting with the Metro, leading on number 10's struggle to defend claims the Prime Minister did not know about the Conservative whip Chris Pincher's alleged reputation for groping. PM facing cabinet backlash over Pincher is the headline in the Telegraph. The Daily Mail says 22,000 crime suspects failed to turn up to court in their exclusive on Monday's front page. The FT leading on the European Central Bank, which is considering stopping banks selling cheap lending schemes as it starts to raise interest rates. The Sun pictures the Only Way is Essex star who was involved in a car crash in Turkey which killed her boyfriend. And happy scorch of July, says the Daily Star, as it predicts we could see temperatures of up to 36 degrees. Wow, 36 degrees this coming week. And don't forget, by scanning the QR code that you can see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us discussing them. And I'm joined tonight by Zoe Williams and Olivia Utley. Great to see you. Let's get cracking. Olivia, why don't we start with you? As it's your paper, The Telegraph, front page, PM facing cabinet backlash over the ongoing story of MP Chris Pincher. I'm sure you saw Work and Pension Secretary Teresa Coffey doing the broadcast round this morning. She was certainly put through the ringer by our very own Sophie Ridge, and apparently some of them are complaining.
Yeah, that was a very awkward interview, and poor Teresa Coffey had other terrible interviews. It seems as though there, according to this Telegraph story, there are 3 cabinet sources who are, there are rumblings that they're not happy with being forced to come out and defend Boris Johnson over the appointment of Chris Pincher, which he was apparently repeatedly warned against. So we're now in the position where there's a source being quoted in the Telegraph saying that over the course of this week, there are going to be cabinet ministers with a surprising number of dental appointments and bereavements because they don't want to have to come out and defend what quite understandably they see as indefensible. So it looks like what we're going to have this week is junior ministers coming out onto the airwaves and being, as you say, put through the ringer, asked millions of questions about Pincher, which, you know, is going to be very difficult for them. It's going to erode trust in the Prime Minister even further, and it's going to just generally be a very bad look. So it just feels, again, as though the Prime Minister has got himself into another completely avoidable crisis. Yeah, you do often think, don't you, that ministers' hearts must sink when they get that message saying it's your turn tomorrow. Zoe, the Prime Minister heading into another week then, facing more questions about his judgment.
Well, the thing is, I don't really agree that it's another avoidable crisis. I mean, that makes it sound like he could have thought more strategically about how to deal with it. And something different. But the truth is, you completely turn a blind eye to, you know, sexual harassment, then it will bite you. And there's no way to get ahead of that with media planning. There's no way to get ahead of that with a kind of better grid. You know, you have to have people in your team who don't grope and harass people, who aren't criminally prosecuted for abuse. You have to have people who don't do these things. And unfortunately, I have to say, I agree with a lot of the commentary over the weekend, which is that the rot starts from the top. Boris Johnson's never had personal standards, and his cabinet and his whips don't, you know.
Yeah, we're struggling a bit with your sound. We're going to try and fix that, Zoe. Olivia, just finally then on this story, let's have a look at the front of the Metro actually while we are still discussing it. Groping for answers is their rather clever headline, I guess. How do you think that the Prime Minister is going to play this in the next couple of days?
I just want to clarify quickly, when I said that that he could have played this a bit better and it was an avoidable crisis, I meant he shouldn't have appointed a groper in the first place, rather than that he should have had a better media officer up to defend the groping practices. I don't know how Boris Johnson is going to deal with it. Yet again, it just feels as though he's hoping that something good is going to come up. He's the sort of perennial optimist, which in good times has made him this charismatic, happy-go-lucky guy who is very popular in the public. But it's also his worst flaw, because he does sort of walk into situations, head in the sand, and just, when everything goes wrong, puts his thumbs up and goes, oh, well, something's going to come up. And it doesn't come up. And this is completely indefensible, and there's no excuse. It seems incredibly clear that he did know exactly what was going on and he ignored it. So it is just, how do you get out of this? I don't know. How can you possibly play it? There is no way of playing it.
OK, all right. Well, let's move on to a different topic. Front page of The Guardian, Zoe. Why don't you tell us about this one?
So I always wonder why the kind of liberal press breaks things down in this way. They say lone parents are struggling more than any other parents. Children in lone parent families are struggling more than any other children. Now it turns out that, it's 1/5 of all children are in lone parent families, and 60% of children in lone parent families are living in relative poverty, which is not just, which is a really serious state of affairs. You're taking the kind of median level of poverty, and then you're saying that they're significantly below that. When you consider how much everybody's struggling at the moment, that's a really significant deal. The thing which I kind of disagree with in a way is that it's actually quite, they call this kind of new and exclusive research, but it's actually very, very obvious as a kind of logical inference that if people in 2-parent working families are struggling, then people in 1-parent working families are going to be struggling more. So they're trying to make a case, I think, that this kind of cost of living crisis and the general overhang of austerity is hitting parents in a kind of, sexually biased, gender biased way, hitting women hardest, hitting lone parent families hardest. But I would lean towards saying there needs to be a really concrete effort for all families who are struggling, because it simply isn't the case that that this was a sort of sexist policy that has brought this about. This is simply the result of poor management over now 10 or 11 years.
Well, what it does do, it certainly sets out the scale of the crisis, doesn't it, Olivia, when it comes to child poverty?
Yeah, absolutely. And as Zoe says, it's sort of between 1/4 and 1/5 of all children are growing up in single-parent families. And there are statistics on what was happening in sort of 2014-15, and it just before the pandemic hit. But it seems very likely that the problem has only got worse ever since COVID hit. Obviously, as Zoe says, it's sort of obvious that a single parent is going to be hit harder than a double income parent. And then we have the cost of living crisis on top of that. So I think sort of drawing attention to those children living in those families is quite a useful thing to do. And I think actually the pandemic and lockdown obviously did hit single parents particularly hard, because being stuck at home in a small flat with your children and no adult company to sort of keep you balanced must have been extremely, extremely difficult. And we're seeing the results of that all over the place. We're seeing results of that in terms of violence against children being on the rise, and definitely child poverty is just increasing. So, another wake-up call to sort out the cost of living crisis in some way that is more meaningful than just sort of getting onto TV and hoping that a minister can dig you out of another crisis. Government's too distracted to deal with this problem.
Yeah, and just before we go to the break, Zoe, let's look at yet another crisis, another area of life that we're having to struggle with. A record 4-month wait, apparently, according to the Daily Express, to buy a house because of the broken system.
I mean, it's really peculiar of the Express to make this case the way they do, because typically in the media landscape, nobody has been more excited by house prices going up than the Express. And so, as you've seen the market accelerate to a point where normal working people on normal salaries could never afford to buy a house anymore, the people with the kind of castanets doing the flamenco around the courtyard were always the Daily Express saying house prices experience record 15% rise. Now, obviously, there is a kind of administrative crisis in the same way that there's an administrative crisis for passports post-COVID, just in the sense that, there's a gigantic backlog, there's a gigantic market correction following the stamp duty suspension and then reinstitution. There's a gigantic surge of interest among a very small number of people who can still afford to buy and exchange housing stock. And that's telling in the time it takes to buy it. But the Express really needs to have a word with itself from a year ago or 2 years ago or 5 years ago. They were the cheerleaders for this completely warped and disorganized system in which the number of people actually exchanging housing stock has got smaller and smaller and smaller. And they're now reaping the benefits of that.
OK. All right, we'll leave that there, and we shall speak again in a moment, because coming up we'll have more from the papers, including this story, also on the front of The Guardian, several killed in Denmark gun attack, that horrific attack in Copenhagen. Discussing that and more in a couple of minutes. Hello again, part two of the press preview. Olivia and Zoe still with us. Front page of The Guardian, Olivia, this awful story this evening. Hearing from the police, several people were shot dead at this Copenhagen shopping centre. A man has been arrested, 22-year-old Danish man, but just awful.
Absolutely awful. Remember what happened in Reading here a few years ago, and these other lone, seemingly possibly terror attacks. It devastates the whole country, and just thinking of the friends and family who've lost people. We know very few details yet. There is this 22-year-old man in custody. People are injured, 3 people are dead, three possibly 4. But yeah, an awful tragedy.
Yeah, they know that several are dead and several injured. We haven't got the figures yet, but I'm sure they'll come in over the next few hours. Your thoughts on this, Zoe?
I mean, there is a kind of history, not a huge history, but a very significant one in Scandinavia with kind of right-wing lone wolf terror attacks. And it's not, obviously, we don't know yet whether that's what this is. But there are questions to answer for the Scandinavians, because they do basically have a lot of anti-immigrant stoking rhetoric, even within quite progressive politics. And that throws up these really peculiar, very violent events, which I think if they didn't indulge themselves so much in mainstream politics with that language, would be easier to track ahead of time. OK. Let's just talk briefly about the situation in Ukraine. It's on the front of the FT, a number of other papers as well. Russia does seem to have the upper hand, doesn't it? Certainly in the east of the country, and we're hearing that Lysychansk, another key city, has fallen to the Russians. Olivia.
Yeah, it is beginning to feel a bit like that. I discovered today that the Battle of the Donbass is one of the longest battles ever. It's just raged for such a long time now, and it feels a bit as though some of Zelensky's supporters in the West are, we saw that G7, all of the rhetoric was there and it was all right, but it feels a little bit as though the momentum has gone a bit from the West side in supporting Ukraine, and they're making the right noises. But as we can see, Scholz has promised so many weapons. The weapons haven't actually arrived. Everything's being a bit slow, and it is feeling as though that sort of weariness in the West is allowing Russia to seemingly get the upper hand. And if the hope is that Putin's men are going to tire, and we've seen time again military experts coming out and saying that their army, yes, it's big, but it wasn't properly trained. They're losing troops at an alarming rate, etc. So, the hope is that Putin's men will tire. But at the moment, that doesn't quite seem to be happening. And the Donbass does seem to be, well, I'm not going to say falling to Russia, because that's too far, but it's not a good situation. And I think it's another wake-up call to keep our eyes on what's happening in Ukraine, because, it's we weren't expecting a war like this, and now we're here, and we can't just let Zelensky suffer.
Yeah, OK. We haven't got time to talk about the front of the Daily Star. I was going to bring this in. We'll perhaps talk about it in the next hour. Happy scorch of July, 36 degrees, swelter, belter, ending the hour on a little bit of good news. The weather is set to stay nice for the next few days.